Hello and welcome to this third event in our speaker series on ethics and tech, brought to you by the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy, a new research center whose mission is to foster research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable, and by the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, an intersectional research community committed to reimagining technology, championing racial justice, and strengthening democracy through a mix of research, culture, and policy. My name is Michael Carey-Nicholas. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. On behalf of both institutes, I will start by acknowledging UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. We have an enormously exciting event and two fantastic speakers today, so I will jump right into it. Dr. Safiya Noble is an associate professor at UCLA in the departments of Information Studies and African American Studies. She is the author of a best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithmic bias in commercial search engines entitled Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. Dr. Noble is the co-editor of two edited volumes, The Intersectional Internet, Race, Sex, Culture, and Class Online, and Emotions, Technology, and Design. She holds a PhD and MS in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a BA in Sociology from California State University, Fresno. Safiya is a recipient of a Hellman Fellowship and the UCLA Early Career Award. And it's not on her official bio yet that I have, but she has recently been named a MacArthur Genius Fellow, which is enormously exciting for all of us here. Dr. Achuta Kadambi is an assistant professor with the UCLA Samuel School of Engineering's Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. He received a PhD degree from MIT and joined UCLA as an assistant professor. His publications have been presented as orals at CVPR, ICCV, ICCP, and SIGGRAPH. He is currently co-authoring a textbook, Computational Imaging, with MIT Press, and is also co-founder in a robotic imaging startup, Akasha.im. Achuta's research has received several recognitions, including the NSF Career Award, Forbes 30 Under 30 in Science, Google Faculty Award, Sony Imaging Young Faculty Award, and Army Young Investigator Award. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Safiya to take this forward. I'm enormously looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to your whole team and everyone at C2I2 who also helped make this event happen. Achuta, I am so excited to get to talk to you today because, well, first of all, we work in this big place at UCLA and we never get to meet each other and connect and have conversations that are, and I have to say it's a treat for me because I don't very often get to meet engineers who want to talk about the stuff I want to talk about. So I'm super excited to get to be in conversation with you as well today. And I don't know, I was thinking maybe just like as we kick it off, there's so many kind of things I want to ask you, but for the benefit of everybody who is logging in, which I think is really to meet you and hear about your work, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what you're working on and what led to kind of where you are right now? And I'm sure there are things where it also our work intersects. And so, you know, maybe we could just like kick it off with some thoughts about your work.
Well, yes, it's definitely a pleasure to be here. So first of all, thanks, Michael, and thanks to the organizers for this fantastic event. So absolutely, we haven't gotten the chance to meet in person. I think part of that is also I'm an assistant professor, and so I joined a couple of years ago, and I had a little bit of time, so I was relatively lucky compared to some of my even more recent colleagues. But I haven't fully set up my lab at UCLA yet. I think we're still setting up the space given the pandemic, but super excited for this new term that is happening upon us now. Now, I can quickly start with context about my own work briefly, and of course, would love to take this back and forth as well.
Sure.
But speaking from my own work, I think a lot of it is actually inspired by, and as corny as this sounds to some degree, it's inspired by the work, Safiya, of yourself, as well as the people who have pointed out algorithmic bias, roughly, dating back into the early 2010s, if not earlier. And I think that field of research, it initially, I was a student when that sort of research was trickling in. It was really a vanguard for reporting biases, which is not very common in engineering practice, especially when I was starting my PhD. And so I started to actually see the eventual growth in this area as people started to, in computer science, kind of understand that, yes, this actually does exist, and wow, this is a huge problem that we missed. And it was really that spark which led me to say, well, if these biases exist in computer science, what, including from my own experiences, where could these biases lie in other areas of engineering practice? For example, in physical devices, are physical devices themselves even biased? And I've had a few encounters and with soap dispensers, so that's kind of the some of the catalysts for at least my own lab doing this research. And this is not I can't say that this is a extremely discriminatory problem, because we're talking about a soap dispenser here, and to some degree, but when you have darker skin, a lot of these dispensers, they trigger based on light. And so they're optically triggered. And it's just a kind of a fact that the darker your skin is, the more melanin pigment you have, the more the light gets absorbed, the less light comes back and gives you a signal. So if you calibrate a device for a certain type of skin tone, then it may not work as well on other skin tones. And may not work as well leads to incidents like, I was in an airport in a European city, and I was trying to use the soap dispensers in the airport. I wasn't able to use it. And I look like obviously I'm a traveler in a very international area. So I'm a foreigner in that country. So I guess maybe a gentleman walks by and maybe thinks I can't read, or I'm not able to use the device, or I've never seen maybe a automated soap dispenser and sink. But he kind of so I'm trying to get that soap dispenser to work, and then he kind of puts his hand there with a lighter skin tone, and it turns on right away. Same thing for the paper towels and so on. So he left the room thinking, okay, boy, he must have really helped out a fool here.
And you're like, I have a PhD in engineering. Thank you very much. It's fine.
But yeah, so that was kind of my kind of very trivialized experience with it, right? It doesn't compare to the discrimination that is happening in many other areas. But even this trivial case of not having devices accessible, for me, coming from a privileged background, it was like, okay, these biases can really happen to anyone. And that is a good example, right? Like, you travel internationally, you have a PhD in engineering, but you kind of look like, a little bit of a village idiot there, depending on how the devices around you are engineered. So that kind of catalyst was like, okay, let us go and use what training that we have been lucky to have in engineering, and let us really study why these biases occur from the fundamental physics level, and then how we can report these biases objectively, and then hopefully lead to downstream better design of medical devices. So the same kind of light-based infrared technology that's often used in these emitters is also used in pulse oximeters, which has been widely reported, especially during the pandemic, as having different disparities across skin types. So to kind of wrap up the short story in a nutshell, that inspiration, along with the inspiration that I had, the seed that was planted from the people working on algorithmic fairness, those two inspirations kind of combined to say, okay, let me focus part of my lab in understanding how does light behave on different types of skin types. And that's kind of it's a very narrow focus, but it's something that we think is a complex problem given all the microstructures and variations in skin.
Yeah, I love this, and I love your work. And I think about how far we've come since the racist soap dispenser kinds of arguments and examples that we were using. I mean, I can remember in like 2010 and 11, when I was a teaching assistant, I was working on my PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I would have all of these computer science students who would take my classes in the information school there. And because, you know, it was like the most like technical social science requirement that they could kind of knock out. And um, back then, those were the kinds of examples that we were reading about and showing in class, and, you know, talking about whether it was a racist soap dispenser or the camera, the digital camera that was asking, you know, are you blinking when Asian Americans, right, were or people with small eyes were using the camera, and so many of those kinds of examples. And, you know, back then, this is just so funny, it's like 10 years ago, and the students then who were undergrads would say like user error, you know, they're just like, there's no way, like you didn't, you know, it was kind of like always back on the consumer or the user of the product as to kind of like why they didn't do it right. I guess kind of like the gentleman who was helping you in the bathroom. And, you know, we knew that there was something more at play here. And of course, we had other eras of technological development to point to. And so I can remember when I was working on the research that became eventually the book Algorithms of Oppression, and you know, arguing like there's something fundamentally happening at the level of how these projects are designed, how they're conceived of, and how they're coded. And to argue 10 years ago that the code was racist or the code was sexist, right? Or that the design logics, like these were embedded at that level, that these were not user error issues. You know, it was like heretical. I'm not kidding. I mean, I could barely find 4 people who would be on a PhD committee and like put their careers on the line to, you know, support the claims that I was making from my research. And, you know, now I think like fast forward to your work and how the life or death kinds of consequences, like whether medical technology can actually detect a health crisis, whether a hip implant will actually extend the life and mobility of women because those implants are like designed off of a prototype of men's bodies, right? With kind of like without like, and of course the challenges of the binary logics, let's just say, right? Like male or female as the only kinds of options. And we know there are so many kinds of body types in the world that, you know, get labeled in these ways, but maybe are profoundly crude and unsophisticated in the way in which they're kind of designed and implemented. So I feel heartened that you're doing your work and that you have this lab here at UCLA and all of the kinds of students who need this work, and of course industry and the broader public who needs the kind of work you're doing. So I know you think of it, you're saying it's like narrow, but it's not narrow to me because I can think of so many applications. And also, of course, you know, just that the authoritative, you know, I don't know, legitimacy that doing this from your field brings to bear in terms of change on these issues, whereas those of us who are social scientists and humanists doing it, you know, maybe we're like kind of at the back of the line in terms of being listened to. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on a really interesting point there, which was if I just kind of go a little deeper into it, the heretical nature of the work that you were doing about a decade ago, roughly about a decade ago. And you're absolutely right, because even today, it's you know, it's become mainstream enough that now there's all this privilege behind it, meaning that, you know, we have funding agencies, we can build tenure cases on these kind of ideas. But back 10 years ago, people were saying, oh, how can an algorithm be biased? That is just, you know, it's like a bunch of numbers and computer memory can't be biased. This person doesn't know anything about algorithms. And that, of course, has been proven wrong now, I think, by the majority of the computer science community, but it did take a decade. And definitely we owe a tremendous debt to the people who were working on this, the few people who were working on this 10 years ago, which has now become, kind of ironically, one of the most popular areas of computer science.
That's good to hear because, um, I think, and maybe, I mean, I don't know if you're experiencing this. I know that to me, to think about the mainstreaming of these ideas, um, the upside is we can do something about it. The downside is there's so much more evidence of harm. It's like undeniable evidence now. It's way more than the racist soap dispenser. It's the algorithms or the kind of large scale computing projects that deny you human and civil rights, right? That over determine what the possibilities for your life could be, whether you can cross a border. I mean, so whether you're the distribution of wealth in our world, I mean, so many factors here. And I once heard when I was a grad student, because I used to work a lot around computer science at Illinois. I remember the dean of engineering at Berkeley once saying that, the challenge for Berkeley engineering was, and of course, these top 5 computer science programs, like they set the tone for the whole nation when it comes to kind of computer science education. I'm wondering what you think of this. He said that his goal at Berkeley was to make engineering at Berkeley like apply it to the world's most pressing problems. And that was, again, like so inconceivable as like that engineering would be a social phenomenon, right? Because so many people, again, thought of it like, again, just what you said, it's like we're just doing applied math. And one of the things my students, that I get a lot of engineering students who take my undergraduate classes when I teach them, and I'll say to them, listen, you have no business designing technology for society and you know nothing about society. Like, how dare you? I mean, you have to actually, we're not talking about technology or design in the abstraction. We're talking about it in the social world. So to divorce those things, has always been, I think, very like difficult. And so I'm just wondering, what do you see, or what are you feeling in your own career around this idea of like engineering in the social world, and of course working with people who study the social world, humanists and social scientists, to do that work?
Yeah, so I definitely think the practice has changed, and interestingly enough, the dean of engineering, I think we might be thinking of the same person, maybe, who is a longtime dean for the last maybe 13 years or so. I went to Berkeley as an undergraduate in engineering, and I remember when he came up on the stage and explained to the freshmen that from now on, the engineering school has a new requirement where you must take, one class per year, per school year in the humanities department. And here's a list of courses, and it was broad. You could take courses from different languages, you could take courses on sociology, political science, and so on. But whatever it is, you must graduate. You won't get a degree from Berkeley Engineering from now on if you don't take 8 of these courses or so, right? And so I think that there is, that dean and what Berkeley Engineering has been doing, what UCLA Engineering has been also doing, is what we're seeing is we're definitely seeing more of a social alignment to the goals of engineering, because ultimately that is our mandate, right? Is to serve society with what we do in a beneficial way. And so how can you do that if you're not understanding the problems of society and making an effort to take classes in other disciplines outside of engineering, listening to faculty in other disciplines, and engaging in that way. So I definitely think it's changing. Change sometimes is gradual in many areas, and this is one of the areas where it's gradual. But I definitely can even see it in the UCLA students compared to the UCLA faculty like maybe, like myself, I would say the students are so different from when I was a student just about 10 years ago. They're so different in that they have a much greater awareness of social problems than I think engineers had 10 years ago. So beyond all the new policies and what faculty are doing, I think it's really our students as well who are starting to embrace the spirit of being socially aligned in how they approach the practice. We talked a little bit about my origin story of how I came to work on the pulse oximeter and medical devices through kind of a personal experience. And I think maybe I'd like to ask you kind of a question here, is that I know you also have an origin story, which we can talk about later, or feel free to expand on that as well. But I often see that, and I've started feeling this more in my own research, where the topic of fairness, it was always a good thing to do, but I really gained that passion for fairness and equity when I experienced inequity myself. Like when I had not experienced inequity, it's a good thing to do, and I can support those incentives. But it wasn't until a fire burned in me that, yes, I need to align my lab to this, when it actually started to affect me, and I realized that this is a problem that that is affecting me personally. And I don't know if it's human nature, but there's like this paradox with a minority group, where a minority group just being reduced in size by definition of being a minority will not experience what the majority has, or the majority will not experience what the minority has. So how can we kind of bridge that divide where folks are motivated to work on fairness and so on without having experienced it themselves?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the framework of fairness has been one that's really been powerfully kind of taken up, especially in like ACM and the kind of fairness, accountability, transparency crew of social scientists who work with computer scientists within ACM. And I've seen and read a lot of papers of people, reviewed papers where researchers are trying to do things like randomly distribute disparity or unfairness, so like trying to make unfairness, let's say, less concentrated on one or two kind of obvious categories of people who are likely to be harmed. And I struggle with fairness as kind of the conceptual logic, because on the surface of it, it seems like, yeah, well, everything should be fair, but that's as almost like an overlay, as if there aren't like huge disparities structurally already, so that even if an individual is kind of randomly being treated the same way as anyone else, it doesn't mean that they're already kind of equal, out the gate. So I feel like fairness is a conversation we need to have in relationship to things like racial justice and economic justice and gender equity, because then we're dealing with both like kind of the individual experience in any particular moment in life, and we're dealing with kind of the structural factors that over determine what will happen, what their future, and kind of current and past possibilities are. So it was one of the reasons why, like in the book, in the book Algorithms of Oppression, I mean, so many, you can imagine all the different kinds of titles that book could have had, all right? And there were a lot of people who did not want me to use the word oppression, right? Like I could have talked about algorithms of unfairness. I could have talked about algorithms of discrimination. But I chose the word oppression because I really wanted us to think about kind of redlining or technological discrimination in a more complex way that helps us understand like unfair exertions of power and control over people and communities. And oppression is really one of those kinds of words that really helps us understand things like powerlessness. Oppression is a word that's like connected to power, systems of power, and how they work in people's lives and communities and around the world. So if you are oppressed, you are a person who generally is rendered powerless, and powerless in a lot of different ways. And that's actually really different than just thinking about kind of fairness, which is, you know, more of like a word like equality, right? Where everyone is, everything is, or everyone is treated equally. But I think fairness is really important because fairness is also like kind of a moral, ethical notion too. And, you know, one of the things that I think has, I've tried to do in my own work is try to engender empathy so that one does not have to necessarily feel and experience harm in order to have empathy or sympathy, but that one can understand that they might be beneficiaries of all kinds of things at the expense of other people, so that they can also question kind of what they have inherited, right? Or what has been afforded to them that they never have to think about. And, you know, we do this in gender studies all the time. You know, I have an appointment in gender studies, and, you know, we all often try to do this. Like, this is so, I mean, I'm just so like from the 80s, but, you know, it's like these ideas of consciousness raising around things that people don't always have to think about, like, you know, women and sexual minorities, and transgender LGBTQ people. Often we think about walking alone at night, like that the world is not designed for our safety in the night, right? And we take back the night, and we do these kinds of efforts to raise awareness so that people who never think, and typically, you know, men and people who are not going to be targeted, right, are people who have more freedom. So it's like, what does that freedom look like? And part of, I think, the way that we help people understand, even if they don't have personal experiences, is to think about what their own freedoms are and why they are, and whether those are generally shared. And then, you know, part of this is also, to me, more importantly, I think in the kind of work you and I do, is to think about how are we systematically reinscribing inequity or oppression or lack of fairness. You know, we could cut in on a lot of different ways, but how are we reinscribing that computationally and through machine learning, and through the kind of application of all kinds of ubiquitous AI that never questions kind of those kinds of conditions or the premise upon which their logics are founded, right, or operating. And that's one of the things I love about like reading about your work, and how you were, you know, you were so clear, like this is actually more than just discriminatory data, right, or data that is you know, unfairly represents people, that goes to inform the design of different kinds of computational and robotics and other types of projects. So I'm kind of curious, like, what you think, because I feel like there's so much emphasis on things like cleaning up the data, or, you know, having better data to inform these things. But I still feel like the data is just too crude in the way that it's captured, in the way that it represents a particular moment in time, and the way that it isn't like historicized, and it isn't representing social structures that, again, can be incredibly oppressive, discriminatory. I mean, we have all the evidence of that. So I know many people think you can just like solve these problems by tweaking the data or having more representative data, but I'm not convinced of that yet. And so I kind of want to know what you think.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the technical answer, and then maybe a more of a social answer. But on the technical side, I think that data set bias, for example, is just to summarize for the audience here as well, that data set bias is roughly speaking, when you, as one example, when you may have an imbalance in your data set that is not representative of a fair structure. It may be representative of society, mind you, or historically society, but that doesn't mean society historically is fair. A good example would be if I were to take a whole bunch of photos from the 1950s of doctors, then they would all be men. And I could do that in a fair process of collecting those images and, you know, equally pick men and women as they appeared in my stack of data, but I'm drawing from a pool that is unfair. And so if you apply that data today and you do a search query for doctors, you're just going to see a bunch of male doctors, for example, on Google Images or so on. So that would be an example of a data set bias. Now, I think if I understood Safiya's question correctly, one of the things that data set bias is obvious when it's presented in hindsight. It is obvious that this is a problem, at least in computer science. So a lot of computer scientists then said, as I think Safiya is alluding to, they then said, well, okay, you know what? All we need to do is just make sure that the sampling is correct. And if we have equal men and women doctors, or pictures of doctors, then we'll be fine. And we can do this for all demographics and all races. Are you happy? You know, people who are, you know, raising this issue. First of all, that issue has not been solved, where the data sets are truly unbiased. But even if it is, there are also downstream ways in that the data is processed that also is where kind of bias can creep in. So an example is, I'll just give you, without even going into a neural network, we can talk about a really simple mean versus median, right? If I have a list of numbers and I take the mean of those numbers, that's the average of those numbers. If I take the median of those numbers, then what I'm doing is I'm sorting the list and then finding the middle and then kind of taking the middle number that is there in a sorted list. Now, what the median does, median is used for a lot of things. And what the median does is, if you choose to use the median, it doesn't account for outliers. And so if you have a minority group that is, for example, being mistreated or oppressed, they just simply won't factor into the calculation. Their discomfort won't factor into these numbers because the median doesn't take that into account. So this is a way that a algorithm itself, the choice of algorithm design, can have a subtle bias in how it operates on data. Okay, so the data set can be biased, the algorithm can be biased, and then finally, we have to also account for the fact that algorithms, the outputs of algorithms, are ultimately read and decided upon by humans. And so there's a human algorithm layer that's at the end of how these things are interpreted. And so, for example, Project Justice, where, for example, judges were making sentences based on computer algorithms, or in medical devices, folks were using algorithms to decide on treatment care, humans will often apply their own biases on the decision of outputs. So these are, you know, there are a lot of technical ways that bias can occur beyond the data set, and including and beyond the data set. There are solutions that people are proposing. No solution has really come out where we have a society that's been deployed to society that's fair. But in the research world, there is progress being made, and fortunately, this is now being encouraged. Thanks again, as I mentioned, to the pioneering work of people about 10 years ago who were pointing out this issue courageously. And solutions include synthetic data, for example, creating synthetic data that kind of mimics a desired distribution. So kind of forcing a correction because our real world is unfair. So having kind of a little bit of a correction factor applied to the data set. Algorithms, for example, having a specific score for fairness that kind of you know, essentially starts to account for people at the ends of the spectrum, because we do want to be inclusive of them. And so explicitly taking that into account. So using exactly the opposite of a median calculation. So there are these solutions. And I think a solution that I hope to see soon, that we are not doing as good of a job at as a field or practice, and including at UCLA School of Engineering, is we also need to hire scientists and give them tenure track positions who and invite them to be our colleagues who kind of have these ideas of how to make the system better, and potentially also come from a background that can connect them with these disparities. Because again, going back to the soap dispenser, if you don't experience it, it's really hard to, uh, you know, even a well-meaning person, it's very hard to induce empathy until you've lived an experience, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I have so many thoughts just about how you and I would redesign UCLA, or like these possibilities for collaboration. I can already, kind of tell, because one of the reasons why we started the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry was that there were so few spaces for the kind of interdisciplinary work that you're talking about. And, and I see all the times kind of the limits, the disciplinary kind of domain limits. And, on one hand, I think I see all of the kind of new jobs that enter kind of the boards every year, because my students are looking for jobs, and my grad students, and we're seeing more and more of these kind of like data ethics types of jobs showing up in engineering schools and information schools. And, on one hand, I think it's like so important that we do that. But I also know that probably the kind of people who will get hired into those jobs are people who have PhDs in some field of engineering. Um, and yet, one of the things I argue for in my book is that what the industry needs to do is it needs to hire people with PhDs in Black studies and gender studies and these fields, sociology, ethnic studies, indigenous studies, Chicano Latino studies, because the the depth of the ability to understand kind of all the attendant social phenomena, history, the complexities. I mean, it's like there's almost like a sense that oh, we can just like read a couple books on like a couple sociology books and then we got it, and you know what I mean, or we just read Noble's book and then we got it, we know what we need. But for I think for humanists and for social scientists, we have just as sophisticated and nuanced and complex types of analyses as other fields in science and engineering, and that is still is kind of not equally respected or understood. And so I'm always trying to think about like, how could we reimagine the university and these research models and your lab and my center and like the spaces and places where the edges of your knowledge meet with the edges of our knowledge, right? And we really like can expand and build in new places, rather than kind of the social scientists and humanists having to also go get a moonlight and get a second degree in engineering to get to participate in the conversations in a meaningful way, and vice versa. So I don't know. I mean, if you had like if you could wave it and say this is how we could reimagine UCLA. Of course, we're here with the law school, and there's so many amazing and interesting colleagues that we have in the law school who are also thinking about like the structural and policy implications, because they work where the rubber meets the road, right? Let's say in courtrooms and in places where public policy is being made that's shaped by the kind of research that we're doing. So I don't know, it's just like a provocation of like, how might we reimagine it? What would be like the fun thing to do? And I'm going to invite those who are interested in like asking questions too, to please drop them here in the chat. And while you're speaking, I'll try to give a glance here and see what else we need to pull into the convo.
Terrific. So actually, this, if I kind of play back that question briefly, like, okay, there are these problems that we've discussed, like, okay, what would be like a bold solution at UCLA, for example, to address these issues? I think I'm going to actually also pick a question to help me with this answer here.
Okay.
So we have Professor Aiello from my department at UCLA as well. So she's asked about if I kind of summarize her question, it's basically like, all right, so diverse faculty, you say that's important. How do we actually make that happen? Because as I alluded to, we have not done a good job on that. And let me start with one reason why it's hard. One reason it's hard is that faculty hiring is a very democratic process where it's a vote that goes out, at least in our department. And so sometimes it's hard to convince the wisdom of the crowd. And I think the question here alludes to something about an old guard. I think, one of the arguments that we get against hiring diverse faculty here that is very common is, oh, we did our best, but the pool wasn't large enough. That is the most common argument. And I think maybe one creative solution there, and we are trying to definitely reach out to faculty, prospective faculty, rising PhD students, but I think maybe we need to take a bolder solution. And maybe Safiya, you kind of alluded to it. What if we did this? What if we actually hired a PhD in, for example, gender studies, a PhD in social equity, a PhD in fields we don't know about as an engineering faculty, but put them actually as a tenure track faculty in ECE, and gave them, the same roles and responsibilities as a faculty, but bringing in also now ECE students that'll just naturally bring in ECE students in close proximity with a faculty who can guide them to issues of social alignment. And that might be a solution because we do see that the engineering pool is less diverse than, for example, the pool in certain humanities areas. So that could be a potential solution. And I think we definitely have amazing kind of leadership in engineering with us. I think Scott served as who just posed the question, served as our associate dean on EDI. And I think the mentor professor was definitely a success. So it's great that we had that. Definitely a step in the right direction. And I think that maybe also having, but still that's a PhD in engineering.
Right.
What if you had a PhD in a different domain?
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is a perfect solution or, but it's something that I think we should discuss and consider what would happen if this made sense. It would certainly, I remember MIT once they hired a dean long ago who of the school who didn't have a PhD, who actually was a college dropout, to give them a more different perspective. And that hire did not actually work out at the very end for an unrelated reason, but for the first 5 years of that deanship, it was considered very successful.
Yeah, I mean, if I look out, I have this appointment at Oxford, at the University of Oxford, and a couple years ago, I went out there before COVID and kind of helped launch this new AI and ethics initiative, and was part of that. And one of the things that was so interesting is they put this new, multi-$100 million initiative into their School of Humanities. Went into like the College of Humanities. And so a bunch of computer scientists, I think it was the department chair for computer science, was co-leading it with one of the humanities professors. And we could unpack like the more of the details of that because there were problems. But I will just say that, if a place like Oxford, which, in the rankings, and again, I always think of like these places like UCLA, these kind of prestige universities, Research One universities, really model and set a tone for how everything else will go. And what I thought was so interesting is like, here we are in the University of California, we're one of the most important research university systems in the country and the world, at least to ourselves, I would say, you know, but I mean, we have this like incredible tradition as a public good, and a resource for the world. And what if we could imagine, I mean, when I think about what it would be like to be in the office next door to you, oh my gosh, what would we be working on? It would be incredible. You know, what if we had these kinds of models at where we had colleges of social science and computing, right? And you see this in information schools. In my field, we have more and more of these kind of computer scientists and social scientists, and they come together under the kind of banner of information schools. But we don't have that tradition as much here in California. And so I think we have some, like, we should be, you know, cooking up some ideas with our colleagues, because I think you're right. I think the students really love, they're so smart and they are so attuned to issues of justice and fairness in the world. They are facing in their own lifetimes some of the most complex issues that to face humanity, in terms of climate crisis, in terms of crushing debt, you know, decreasing quality of life and opportunities. I mean, they are completely attuned, and they want to work on solving these problems for the generations to come. So we have so much opportunity. I feel like when I think about your work, I think, you know, we're in a moment, and that this moment is going to really set the terms for many generations to come. And if we thought about our work across multiple generations, like, what are our responsibilities, we would much like the scientists who worked on the atomic bomb, you know, it was, they were interesting science questions, and then before it was about to be used, they were like, hold on, hang on a second, we regret. So, you know, I think like that's what's so valuable about the kind of interdisciplinary possibilities, is we might say, hey, because we can do some things doesn't mean we should, or we have history and all of these other kind of opportunities to learn from. And we don't do that as much, I think, when we're so siloed. So yeah, I guess this is a plea for the people in power who might ever watch our talk, that they should come and talk to us. We have some ideas. Okay, so is there anything in here? I mean, I know we're kind of, we're, before you know it, we're going to run out of time. But I'm just looking here through some of the questions, of course, you know, about the diversifying the student body, and you know, we definitely need to do that. And of course, I think some of these things are like generational, around kind of what was true of the past, and these tensions probably exist in every generation. These kind of intergenerational challenges of like the turns toward some different imagined future that that people want. I don't know what else here in here. Are there, so you see some questions that you want to kind of take on? I mean, I love some of these questions around, oh, market incentives. So let's talk about industry, because your school works much more closely with industry than mine at the moment. So I'm just wondering, like, do you feel like the pressure to conform with like what the industry standards are, or do you feel like if the researchers and the kind of research community and the universities push out different kinds of students that are trained differently, that that will be the impact, or are we waiting for industry to call up these kinds of workers?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that I was actually going to say the same thing, that I would pick up the market incentives question as well. I think that, you know, I like the way you also mentioned climate, you know, briefly, Safiya, I think kind of offhand, because both climate and I think kind of fairness, uh, these are actually both very similar areas, in the sense that there isn't a clear market incentive, unfortunately, in a capitalist society that we live in right now, for industry to align with this more than a checkbox, in my opinion. Um, the in industry, you're not looking at how the climate is going to be for our grandchildren, right? It's not on your quarterly reports of your financials and your profit and loss, right? Your annual P&L. And I think that that is actually a huge issue, because so much of engineering is also driven by industry. It depends how the students kind of also start to align themselves with how they see their future trajectory going. It aligns with the funding that the engineering school receives, and it aligns, of course, with, if not at least in a subliminal level, definitely at some level with how computer science professors and electrical engineering professors may approach their research as well. So I do think that it would definitely be a boon if industry was to incorporate these in. I don't have a good idea, because I'm not an economist. This is where we should really have an economist maybe join us, of how we would get, problems like climate change, problems like fairness, which are, I think many people will agree, are super, super important. But, how do we make that, with some financial backing?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were to like pick a problem, between your work and mine, I would say, how could we take up an issue like climate change, which we know is a racialized issue. We know disproportionately affects the global South, that under-resourced nations, that is creating spaces and places that are uninhabitable, one of which might be California at some point. Looking at our own kind of the effects of climate change here in our state. I think about that as not just a matter of like a computational problem to solve, like how do we use data to help us solve climate change, but how do we imagine, one of the things I say to my students, I don't know where my phone is, it's around here somewhere, but I'll say to my students, my computer science students, like, here I have a microphone, but this doesn't have a processor chip in it, a microprocessor chip. But I'll say to my students, like, any device that I have within arm's reach that I will grab in a lecture, and I'll say, you want to impress me, but I'm holding a phone, and I'll say, make a phone that we can, that will grow a tree when we're done with it, that we can eat, like something. I mean, like the fact that electronics and hardware, which, we haven't really talked about as much in this kind of specific way, but, things that run on microprocessor chips have a huge, and that require energy, have a huge impact on the environment. I mean, this is just like the evidence is here. We understand like large scale data modeling. This was the thing that our colleague, Dr. Timnit Gebru at Google, the lead data ethicist there, was fired over her co-authorship of a paper that challenged what Google was doing in terms of, its large-scale data modeling. In part, this was one dimension of her paper, was large-scale data modeling and its impact on the planet. So I wonder, like, this is like such an exciting place where we should be working. And when I say exciting, I mean depressing, but also really important, that we could imagine hardware and design and electronics and processing and computing with things like climate change in mind, that again would force innovation into different kinds of systems and solutions that are not so dependent upon, like, extractive models or assumptions of kind of unlimited resource, or like, who cares, because the laptops and phones get loaded up on a barge and they get, dumped into an e-waste site in Accra, Ghana, not into Beverly Hills, or Westwood. So, no one's looking at that in the same way. And so I just wonder, like, about the possibilities for taking on those kinds of things with the, again, these kind of like multiple perspectives. Do you think it's possible? Can we get the changes? And I do believe that they get innovated out of the university in so many ways.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of creative ways to do that. I mean, this seminar series being one such example. Yeah, I think that is hopefully the direction things are heading in. And I don't know if later on, maybe in a few generations from now, if universities will actually have academic departments, right? Or if there'll actually be kind of just an overall one school. We're almost seeing that in some forms of engineering, where different forms of engineering now are very similar, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's a lot of possibilities for the future. I guess I feel like we should call Michael back in and just see if there's anything else. I did see a question that was for the law school that I know he can better understand about this track around ethics and the law and tech. Of course, we do know that, Michael, your new institute is really about, I think, making visible these pathways and these possibilities for law school students or people who are interested in policy and the laws. So, just want to say before I hand the mic back to you that I am so grateful to have had an opportunity to be a part of this conversation. It's such it's a thrill, truly, Achuta, to get to meet you and talk to you and welcome you to UCLA. And I can't wait to be back on campus and get to meet you in person.
Likewise, thank you so much, Safiya. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I've just been sort of hovering in the background, enjoying this very much. I knew it was going to be a fascinating conversation, and it's great to hear that the two of you connecting. On the law school question specifically, we increasingly hear, I think, from folks in the private sector that they're realizing that this is a gap that they need to fill. I think one of the really glaring aspects of that has been in content moderation of platforms, where there's been all this focus on sort of data management and the structure of how these platforms deliver information, process information, manage user experience, and the ethical questions have really been left by the wayside until really just a few years ago, when the platforms were dragged kicking and screaming into finally accepting a bit more responsibility of the impacts that they've been having. And as a result, we've seen this enormous scaling up of people that work on public policy, content policy, quasi-ethical issues, certainly at Facebook, Twitter, maybe at Google. I'm less familiar with it happening at Google, but maybe it's happening. But I get these pings from people at Facebook and Twitter all the time that they're constantly looking to bring people in what would probably be described as like a legal ethics type space, dealing with various content moderation issues. So I know that there is a growing need for this stuff. Whether or not that's being addressed at law schools, I think it's a novel area of law and development, and so it's understandable that educational institutions are going to sort of track behind that a little more slowly. But certainly, as we're starting to see increasing engagement with these ethical questions at the legal level and with regards to the interplay between law and tech, I think this is going to be an increasingly important area, not only for educational institutions to address, but I think that the market demand is going to be there, which should drag some more attention to this. So all that's a long way of saying that like this institute that we're doing is super important. But yeah, I certainly agree that there needs to be a focus on those issues. I guess I can wrap it up then and offer strong thanks to both of you for participating. As Safiya alluded to earlier, part of the purpose of this institute is to set up these kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations, both directly in terms of fostering connections and sometimes, I guess, in front of an audience. So I'm glad that there seems to be some great sharing of ideas, and I hope that we can build on this. I will just take a moment to quickly plug a few events that we have coming up. Our next Ethics in Tech event is on October 20th, and that's going to be a conversation between myself and Dunstan Allison Hope of Business for Social Responsibility, where I guarantee we will be talking about exactly that question that we just raised: is private sector demands for bringing in social responsibility consulting or to address these kinds of ethical questions. Next week, we are going to be hosting a series on ethical licenses and the future of open source. So that's, I think, also going to be super interesting, featuring guests from the EFF and Mozilla and Wikimedia and a bunch of, and the Organization for Ethical Source, and a bunch of really awesome stakeholders in this space. And the following week, we will be hosting an event on calibrating data surveillance. And that is going to feature Ron Diebert from Citizen Lab, Asaf Lubin, Alan Rosenstein, a bunch of brilliant profs and other civil society people. So we're also enormously excited for that. And then in the first week of October, it's our big gangbusters event on power and accountability in tech, which actually Sarah Roberts is going to be one of our speakers for that. So lots of great events. I pasted, I think, links to the Eventbrites into the chat. I hope folks can join us for those. Safiya, Achuta, thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed the conversation. I knew it was going to be fantastic, and it did not disappoint.
Thanks so much for inviting us, and thanks everyone for listening in.
Great. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you at our future events.
Great.